Perfect. All right. So it was towards the end of Jesus' ministry, like right towards the end. It was basically, it was during his final week. And, given that he was saying goodbye, Jesus does a really good job of knowing he's going to die and preparing his disciples for it. Like we have the whole Last Supper and everything. And at the end, like one of the things he ends up telling the disciples in a way that he doesn't previously is he starts to talk to them about how, hey, look, I'm going to die. I'm going to go away. However, I'm going to be back. I'm going to come back. And that idea of Christ is going to be back, because we're very good at naming things, we have called it the second coming because Jesus comes a second time, right? Like, we're just really good at this. It's great. Anyway, so Jesus talks about the second coming, and there's, as he talks to his disciples, one of the most famous passages that he talks about is in Matthew chapter 24. This is what he tells them, the disciples, before he dies. He tells them, he says, when the Son of Man returns, it will be like it was in Noah's day. In those days before the flood, the people were enjoying banquets and parties and weddings right up to the time Noah entered his boat. People didn't realize what was going to happen until the flood came and swept them all away, and that is the way it will be when the Son of Man comes. 2 men will be working together in the field. One will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding flour at the mill. One will be taken, the other left. Okay, so that last part especially, if you are my age, like that is seared into your brain. If you were in the church in the 90s, particularly in the youth group, the Left Behind series was like Star Wars. Like the weird homeschool kids who couldn't read Harry Potter, they read Left Behind. Like Kirk Cameron became our hero. All of us, like at least it felt like that. I don't know, maybe if it wasn't actually that real, but like to us, like when we were in the church, like in that church bubble as kids, it felt like the most important story and like the biggest story, and everywhere we went, people were talking about it, and then they made movies about it and all this stuff. And so the Left Behind series became this thing, and basically what the Left Behind series was, a pastor, a teacher deciding to take his theology about the second coming and putting it into these like young adult novels, like The Hunger Games, but with more apocalypses. So that's what it was, and it became this massive cultural thing to the point where everybody had to address it. And it's funny because whether you agreed with that particular interpretation of the way that Jesus would return or not, you had to become familiar with it. Because you had to either say, yeah, I think it's a good idea and it's biblical, or I don't think it's a good idea and it's biblical. And so while like today, like you can go in church and hang out in the church for a while and never talk about like the end of the world, when I was growing up, you couldn't. Like every time, like we always talked about the end of the world. And so these passages, they were like, this was as familiar as John 3:16 to me. Like this whole thing. And again, it wasn't just the people that bought into it. It was the people that didn't buy into it and felt like they had to argue with it. And it just became this whole thing. Well, as it turns out, like if you guys have been listening to me preach for long enough, you know I have a very specific stance on the end times and the second coming and things like the rapture and the millennium. And my very specific stance is I'm never going to tell you anything. Because there's no point. Like, I don't know. Like, I have my own ideas or whatever, but, like, I don't know. And there's no reason for me to tell you things I don't know. There's absolutely no reason for you to be like, hey, I should agree with Drew on this unprovable thing that he has some vague notion about. So, look, if you care about it, awesome. If you don't care about it, awesome. I don't care. Believe what you want to believe. But I think that in this case, there's something that we need to see, that if we can kind of zoom out and we can kind of just say, okay, forget the second coming, forget all that. Let's just kind of zoom out of what Jesus is saying. There's something really, really vitally important here that we need to see about like everything in our faith. You see, Jesus says that the second coming, whatever that is, however it is, whenever it is, whatever, that the second coming is something that is like the flood. It's like the days, not just the flood, but the people in the days of Noah. And what he says is that the story of the flood, again, however we interpret it, in the story of the flood, people didn't know that it was going to show up. People didn't know that there was going to be a flood. So they just lived their lives as if nothing was on its way. He said it would be, the people were enjoying banquets and partings. And I think that the weddings thing is really interesting because he says, like, people got married just before the flood. Like people live their lives, and that's a really interesting thing to say because a wedding, if nothing else, makes a giant assumption about the future, right? That there is one. There's no point in getting married if you don't think that you're going to live for years and years and years and decades and decades and decades. There's no point. You know, why go through the motions? Why spend all that money? Why try to build a home when there will be nothing in the future? The idea of there were weddings before the flood is a really fascinating way of saying people were making plans for the future where there was no future. That God had an idea and we had an idea and they were not the same thing. Interestingly enough, you also see this picture. We always talk, I remember the whole like, don't be left behind thing. And I remember there was a preacher friend of mine who he did this whole thing and he was reading all this stuff and he's like, I'm pretty sure you want to get left behind in the passage. Which is funny because I don't know, but like this whole like idea of being left behind, we always talk about like two people in the field, one goes away, one is left, all that, right? And we can argue about which one you want to be. But you notice they're at work. I mean, think about that. The thing Jesus is saying, he's talking about like people planning a future and going to weddings and stuff. And then he says, you know, 2 women are grinding flour at the mill. 2 men are working in the field. They went to work. Guys, by show of hands, if you knew the world was ending Tuesday, how many of you go to work on Monday? I see no hands. Like, that's the whole thing. Like, if you knew that you were you were going to die or the world was ending or whatever, there's no way you would go to work. For what purpose? To get a paycheck you can't spend? To help some other guy make some money he can't spend? Like, look, I know a lot of us, like, I love my job, but, like, you know, at the end of the day, like, I don't love it so much that if tomorrow tomorrow the world was going to end and I knew it, like, I wouldn't be here. It's just the truth. Other than to be like, I'd be like, hey guys, the world's ending. Go have fun with your friends. And then I would leave, maybe. But this idea, what Jesus is saying is people will be so oblivious to what's coming that they will literally go to work the day the world ends. That is how little we know about the second coming of Christ. That is how little we know and how little we will know. And then he takes it, actually, that's not even it. Let's rewind to the passage. Before he even says any of that, we see one of the craziest passages in the entire Bible from a philosophical perspective. But this is what we read. And again, in the Gospel according to Matthew, just before he says all that, Jesus says, however, no one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen. Not even angels in heaven or the Son himself. Only the Father knows. Man, that's crazy because, look, I'm not going to pretend to like be able to understand the way that God operates, right? Like God becomes a man, but then God in heaven knows something that God, the man, doesn't know. That's weird. Like if Jesus is God, he should know because he's God and God knows. It's all very confusing. I don't know. That's kind of the point of the whole sermon, guys. That thing, that just kind of check that in. Anyway, what Jesus says is he doesn't know when it's going to happen. And that's important because if you think about that, like, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out anything about the second coming if I just tell you when. Like, if I tell you that the second coming of Christ is on December 12th, 2044, well, I've eliminated every single person of being included in the events leading up to it prior to those dates, right? Like, I know it wasn't in 1380. I know it wasn't 70 AD, that, right? Like, if I know a date, then I can do. Also, I feel like we'd be pretty good at picking out, like, major events and wars and the Antichrist, whatever you believe in or don't believe in. We'd be pretty good at figuring it out if I just gave you a date. The date is sort of like the answer key. It's like you're in an escape room, right? And you find like that one clue that unlocks everything. That's the date. If we knew the date of it, we'd figure out everything else. We would know what's a metaphor. We would know what's literal. Like all of our arguments would basically be over if we just had a date. And that's the thing we don't have. We don't have the answer key. We can't get out of the escape room because we don't have the clue. And not only do we not have the clue, but Jesus doesn't have the clue. The point is, we don't know. And we have to be okay with that. Like, we just do. Like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't read and study and learn and try to figure it out. And if nothing else, it's fun, right? And but I'm not saying that you shouldn't try. I'm just saying ultimately, we don't know. And we have to be okay with the fact that we don't know. Now, I don't think anything here is overly new. Like, I think you guys were like, yeah, we know this stuff. But here's the thing. If that's the way it is for that particular piece of information, a question has to be asked. Are there other things that we just don't know? And I know we don't, look, I don't know if there's aliens, right? I don't know if dinosaurs had feathers or not. When I was a kid, it was no feathers. Now it's feathers for them all. I don't know. Like we found feathers on the T-Rex. Did you? I don't know. I just think it's goofy to think about like a Tyrannosaurus Rex running around with feathers. Like a huge chicken. That's not intimidating. Like, you guys watch Jurassic Park and the guy, like the T-Rex eats the guy in the toilet? Can you imagine if that had feathers? No, it would never happen. Anyway, I don't know. There's things we don't know. But of course, what I'm saying is, are there doctrinal things? Are there religious Christian things that we just genuinely don't know a lot about? That maybe I could put it like this. We know there's a second coming of Jesus somehow, some way, some when, right? Like it either did already happen or it's going to happen. Like we have all sorts of interpretations, a million interpretations, but we know it's a thing, right? Are there other things like that it's a thing and we think we know, but maybe we don't know all that it's about? Well, this is what Paul tells Timothy in his first letter to Timothy in 1 Timothy 3:16. Paul says, "Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory." What's fascinating is all of those things, that list of things there, you would think that you understand. But Paul calls them a mystery. A mystery. Something you don't know a lot about that you need someone to reveal to you. Right? Like he talks about like God does reveal. Like elsewhere, Paul, this is one of Paul's favorite things. It's funny that we don't always recognize this because more than 20 times, like 24, 25 times in the New Testament, Paul talks about the gospel and basic facts that we say that we believe in. He calls them mysteries. And what he's saying is, okay, look, God does reveal this stuff to you, of course, but it's not like you super understand. 25 times Paul says basic facts of information that you think you understand, that's actually a mystery. And we talk about, like he says, the mystery of godliness. He was manifest in the flesh, so God becomes a person. We think we understand that. That's the whole Christmas thing. Paul calls it a mystery. Is seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed in the world. None of these things are, to our minds, things that we're like, I don't get that. But the truth is, not only do we not get it, but the only way we do get it is what God has revealed, and we in our imperfect brains have attempted to interpret. We're not talking about just the second coming, this nebulous whatever thing. We are talking about the basics of our faith are mysterious. Which is a fancy way of saying this. We don't know nothing. I mean that like, we don't not know anything, but we don't know a lot. And I mean knowing, like, look, I know you are all sitting there listening to me right now. I know that because I can see you. I've talked to a lot of you this morning. I shook your hand. I gave you a hug, whatever it is. I know that you're here. I don't have to have faith that you're here. Right? Like, I don't have to believe that you're sitting here. I don't have a hope that you'll be sitting here. I don't trust that, like, I'm using all the words we use for religion, right? Faith, hope, trust, belief. when we talk about God, when we talk about our religion, when we talk about what we know or whatever about Jesus, we're not using the kind of language I use to say that, like, I know there's a McDonald's a quarter mile from my house. I know there's Jose Jalapenos right across the street. Okay, like, I know that, like, I can walk up the street and there's a school. I know that right now in my house I've got 165 pounds of fluffy dog. Like, I know I am married to Stephanie Snyder. Like, there's things you know. But Christianity is about faith and trust and hope and belief. It's something else entirely. And what that something else is we have confidence. Like, everyone, we have enough confidence and trust in God that we have ordered and centered our lives around what we believe. But we don't know. This stuff is mysterious, says Paul. We don't know. And we have to figure out how to live with that. All of this leads me to our final animal. Guys, I'm sad. I wish that next week I'd be like, hey, another animal. But we're out. We're done. Like, there's only so many lessons you can have for extinct animals. So, 6 is the answer. That's the answer. We're going to talk about last. We got to talk about the mammoth, the woolly mammoth. It's on the slide. We had to talk about the mammoth. And this is really famous. You guys know what a mammoth is. The thing about the mammoth is, like, it's basically just a big elephant that lived in North America and it was bigger and it was fuzzier. That's basically it. That, like, you guys know. Most of our, like, research is just looking at elephants and being like, it's the same thing. Which is fun because, like, maybe it wasn't. I don't know. Maybe the woolly mammoth was they were like fantastic tap dancers, and we don't see that in elephants. They lost that. I don't know. I'm just saying, like, we just always assume that they're the same thing. But that's just it. That's it. So think giant elephant. And, they lived in family units. They seem to act the same way. They lived for like 70 years. Like, all the things that elephants do, we can basically observe in the fossil record. It seems like the mammoths did the same thing. And the mammoths went extinct. They finally went extinct for good, like 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. But the way it worked was, like, extinction sometimes takes time, and so there was, like, the mammoth, like, thrived and was dominant in North America until about 10, 12, 14,000 years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood, and then the extinction kind of began. And then it trickled out and dwindled until 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. The last one was up in Siberia or whatever, right? So the reality is we're going to treat the extinction as being about 10 to 12,000 years ago because that's when that event happened. And the question we should ask is, what was that event? What made mammoths die out? Because, again, we're talking, a very, very long time that they ruled. We're talking, they were dominant creatures. They didn't have really predators, like, at least, like, the full-grown ones didn't. And something had to do something to make this animal go extinct. And the question is, what? And as it turns out, we've got lots of options. It's just, I got to tell you, the options aren't great. We've talked about this. We've already had a couple animals we've talked about, and climate change was the answer. It's the third time we talked about this during the series that, about 100,000 years ago, there was an ice age that was beginning, and it lasted for about that 100,000 years. And then about 10, 12,000 years ago, the ice age breaks. It gets a lot warmer. The earth completely changes, and it wreaks havoc with the various animals that were on the planet. We've already talked about a couple that it made a huge difference, and it led to their extinction. And so a lot of people think, okay, well, the climate change must have wiped out the mammoth. It makes a lot of sense. And it makes doubly sense when you consider what we talked about during the saber-toothed cat sermon, right? Like, if you guys remember, the saber-toothed cat, it went extinct because its prey changed. And its prey changed because the grasses changed. And only some animals were able to digest the grass and others weren't. We know that today, elephants spend about 2/3 of every day eating grass. They eat so much grass. So you would think an animal, as the grasslands change, an animal that spends, 16 hours a day eating, did I get that math right? Yeah, 16 hours a day eating, that would make a big deal to the mammoth. But see, here's the problem with the climate change theory. We have dig sites for mammoths up in Alaska in that climate, and we have dig sites for mammoths down in Mexico in that climate. And I don't know who here has been to both Alaska and Mexico. But honestly, those are two very different days out. Like if you're like, I'm going to go visit Alaska, you're loading up the coats. If you say like, I'm going to Mexico, you're taking the swimsuit and nothing else, right? If mammoths were able to live concurrently at the same time, all the way up in Alaska and all the way down in Mexico, what climate change could wipe them all out? Like you could buy that maybe the climate change impacts the ones in the south and maybe the climate change impacts the ones in the north or whatever. But it would be very hard to argue for a climate change that would impact both. So it probably wasn't that. So then we think, okay, it's probably people because it's always people. So the last couple of weeks, we talked about how reckless people were, killing the great auk and the Tasmanian tiger. Like we did all that. And so we think, okay, well, maybe we killed them. And the important thing to know is we know if they died out 10, 12,000 years ago, we know that there were people around living with them 10, 12,000 years ago. So maybe that's it. Like they all lived together. When there's a murder, who do you look at? Whoever's in the home, right? That's the people. Here's the problem with that. I want you to imagine for a second that you were alive 10,000 years ago. I want you to imagine you don't have a smartphone. You don't have a gun. You may not even have a bow and arrow, and if it is, it ain't a good one. You've got a stick and a rock. You barely have shoes. How many mammoths are you killing? The answer is not a lot. Probably none. It is the height of arrogance for us to believe that like our ancient ancestors could like kill woolly mammoths to death. Because there's also no point. Forget the arrogance to believe we could. There's no point. There was all sorts of animals back then. There's all sorts of fish, birds, smaller animals to hunt. There would be no motivation to go for the biggest, strongest, hardest to kill animal unless you're just like Crazy Earl and you get drunk one day and all your friends are like, let's go kill a mammoth. And then they all go die. That's how this would have worked is the regular people would have killed like deer and squirrels and stuff. And the crazy people would have got stomped. In fact, this is actually great. We have something. These numbers are a little old, so don't super quote them. But the within the last couple decades, at that point we had like 1,500 dig sites for mammoths. We had somewhere in the neighborhood of like 60 of those dig sites had evidence that people were there too. That's it. And then we had like 10, 12 that had evidence that we tried to kill a mammoth. 1,500. 10. That actually tracks. You got 10 Crazy Earl conversations where they got drunk one day and decided to kill a mammoth and it didn't work. That's it. That's our relationship with the mammoth. We didn't kill these things. We certainly didn't kill them enough to make them go extinct. So there's another theory. Got one more. Another theory is disease. Like maybe we gave, like this happens when human populations get together, right? Is, somebody has like the flu and they've never had the flu and it kills a bunch of people, right? Like we've seen that in our history. So maybe there was some sort of virus, bacteria, whatever that jumped from one to the other. And in fact, there's actually the theory that it probably wasn't from us, but we had dogs. Because dogs are the best. We had dogs running around with us 10,000 years ago. And so the thought is that maybe the dogs made the mammoth sick. And that's one of those theories that sounds really good because it is wildly theoretically possible. Absolutely. But I would like to point out that today we have dogs and elephants that hang out together. We also have people and elephants who hang out together, and we didn't make those go extinct. So, like, it's a weird jump in logic to say that the ancient version of an elephant got extinct because of a dog. The bottom line is this: we don't know. We know there was once an animal. We have called it a mammoth. We know that an extinction event happened, and over a few thousand years, they all went away. That's what we've got. And maybe one day, like maybe in the future, somebody will find a dig site that tells us exactly what happened. But at the moment, we have these very flawed theories. And there's people that will just defend to the end their belief that these theories must be right. It's definitely climate change, or it's definitely disease, it's definitely people, whatever. But all of them have their own various flaws. And so all of them leave us just saying, us rational people, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting how similar that is to the Christian faith. But it's also interesting how unsatisfying it is. It's been fun. It's been nice. Last 5 weeks, I've been able to say, here's an animal, here's what happened, here's what we learned. Here's another animal, here's what happened, here's what we learned. Here's another animal, here's what happened. It's very nice and neat and orderly. But this one, here's an animal, we don't know what happened. It's wildly unsatisfying. It's like watching a TV show and it's a cliffhanger. Right? And then, they don't finish the show. It's happened. Sometimes you're watching a show that's not super popular. It gets to the end of season 3 and it's a cliffhanger. And then they're like, well, nobody was watching it. So season 4 is not a thing we're going to make. And then you just have to sit in the fact that you'll never know forever. It's a terrible feeling. It makes you never want to watch TV again. Right? So anyway, it's like that. And existentially, I think it's also, when we talk about religion, it's also really disconcerting. And I think this is one of the biggest reasons why people end up leaving their faith. See, here's the deal. You guys all remember, you first became a Christian, and it's just so exciting to, learn new stuff. And that may go for, years, where every time you go to church, you hear something new. And every time you open your Bible, you see something new. And every time, it's always new. And you find you're learning, and you're just kind of a sponge for information. But there comes a point, and you guys know how sponges work when they're full. And there comes a point when there's no more information really to give. And I don't mean we know everything. I mean, we get to a point when we realize, oh no, everything's a dead end. I take this on faith. I trust in God because I don't know. There isn't information that will unlock everything. And that can be really disconcerting for people. And it kind of makes people go one of two directions. A lot of people decide to get really dogmatic about stuff. I don't know, but I'm going to scream at you like I do know. That'll be how I deal with that. Those people often become preachers. Just... let me tell you the unknowable mystery that I know. It's ridiculous. And that turns people off, obviously, but also it's a defense mechanism. It's a defense mechanism to say, I know that which I don't know, because it makes me feel better to pretend like I know. On the other hand, there's other people that are like, well, I don't know anything, so I can't do anything, and so might as well not do anything, and I might as well just quit being a Christian. What's fascinating is people that become super crazy fundamentalist Christian and people who become agnostics or atheists. It's wonderful and hilarious and heartbreaking all at the same time. How their assumptions of God, the Bible, Jesus, religion are exactly the same. It's just one doubled down on a point they couldn't know, and one abandoned it all because I don't know. Both are just defense mechanisms, trying to deal with the fact that we just can't know things. Christianity is about faith and trust and hope. I believe with all of my heart that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died on the cross, that everyone is saved through him. I don't know that. I'm confident enough to have built my entire ethical system around it. I'm confident enough to have built my entire life around it, including my life, job, career on it. But I don't know. How could I? Paul, who literally, guys, Paul talks about like, I got taken up to the third heaven. I don't know what that means. Paul's like, Jesus talked to me for 14 years. That's crazy. Paul is like, the risen Christ appeared to me and I went blind. Paul got so much more information. And Paul, 20 some times, talks about how the gospel is mysterious and we don't know it. If Paul doesn't know, random preacher at random church at random state at random time doesn't know. And we have to be okay with that. Unfortunately and sadly, I think sometimes I've known people that it's over. And so the question is, what can we do so that's not us? I'm going to say it one more time. I'm 40 years old, and my life is built around Jesus. When I'm 55, it might not be. I hope so. Everything I'm doing now is planning on it being, but I don't know what happens over the next 15 years, right? Like, that's why we continue to be faithful. We continue to follow, because one never knows where life takes us. It's possible that this could be us losing our faith, and I don't want that. So what do we do? Well, the answer is found, I think, in a story of my favorite Bible character, and that's Peter. I always talk about how much I love Peter, because he's sort of terrible, and I can relate to that. The guy who is really bad at being a follower of Jesus, that's my guy. Well, there's one day, the Apostle Peter runs into a problem. It's not a famous story in the Bible. It should be, probably. But what happened was Herod the Great, the guy who tries to kill Jesus when he's a baby, Herod Agrippa is his grandson, and he's like the king of Israel. He's the like puppet king of Rome over Israel. And he decides he's going to try to finish what his grandpa started, and he's going to try to wipe out the church. But he takes a different tact. Instead of just killing like any Christian he finds, that's not a super great strategy to do this. Other people tried, but it wasn't a great strategy. He said, well, I'll just kill all the leaders. Like, these apostles are running around. I'll just arrest all of them and I'll kill them. And the first one he did was James. James, the brother of John, one of the inner circle of Jesus. We don't read about his ministry because he gets beheaded. Like, Herod Agrippa arrests him and puts him to death, and that's that. And the people were good with that. The people liked it. They don't like the church. They don't like Christians. And so this apostle, they're good with that. And they say, okay, well, let's kill some more. And so they arrest Peter. And Peter is taken into custody so that he as well can be taken. And he was actually arrested during the Passover. And so they were going to do a whole thing, surrounding the Passover. So he was killed as part of the celebration. It's really sad and depressing, but that was what was going to happen. So this is what we read in the book of Acts, chapter 12, happened with Peter. It says this: the night before Peter was to be placed on trial, he was asleep, fastened with 2 chains between 2 soldiers. Others stood guard at the prison gate. Suddenly there was a bright light in the cell, and an angel of the Lord stood before Peter. The angel struck him on the side to awaken him, and said, "Quick, get up." And the chains fell off his wrists. Then the angel told him, "Get dressed and put on your sandals," and he did. "Now put on your coat and follow me," the angel ordered. So Peter left the cell following the angel, but all the time he thought it was a vision. He didn't realize it was actually happening. Now, look, maybe Peter's an idiot. Like, that's possible. Probable. But this story is fantastic. God saves Peter, and as he's saving Peter, Peter's like, this isn't real. This is literally not happening. He is in the story and doesn't know the story is happening. The amount of obliviousness here. Wives, do not relate this to your husbands. How oblivious men can be. He is so oblivious. He's just like, it must be a vision or a dream. Or like, he genuinely doesn't know as he's in the story that God is saving him. And the question is why? And the answer, I think, is actually really great. You see, Peter thinks he's going to die. What would you do if one of your closest friends died and then you were next? You don't know that God is coming to save you because God didn't come to save your best friend. You have no idea what's going to happen. What would you be doing? You would be preparing yourself emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You would be saying, okay, tomorrow I go to trial. After that, I'm going to die. I wonder how they'll do it. They crucified Jesus. That's on the table. They stoned Stephen. That's on the table. They beheaded James. Like maybe that's Herod Agrippa's favorite method of doing it. But regardless, you would be praying. You'd be preparing yourself for what's to come. Peter was so intently, faithfully trying to die well that when he was saved, he didn't notice it was happening. I think that's maybe the best definition of Christianity we can give. Because there's a lot we don't know, but there's stuff you do know. You know what love your neighbor feels like. You know what pray for those who persecute you. You know what that is. You know, if you're married, you know husbands love your wives. Your wives love your husbands. Like, you know that. Like, you know, like, what God has given to you. If you have children, you know there's instructions about how you raise your kids. Like, you know what that stuff means. Peter wasn't even considering the notion that some crazy event, like an angel shows up. He got all these guards around him, and some angel would show up and lead him out of the cell and save his life. He had no idea. Because Peter was focused on what he could do instead of speculating and sitting in and stewing in what he didn't know. So often, I think we become just absolutely paralyzed because we don't know what the next step is to take in our lives. And I think with Christianity, it's not helpful because we don't know. Like, all of this is a mystery. Our entire religion is faith and trust and hope. It's belief without knowing. But the truth is, like, you know what you should do tomorrow. You know how you should be today. You know what kind of husband or wife or parent or employee or friend or son or daughter you should, or neighbor. You know how you should treat the person you're just checking you out at the grocery store. You know how you should treat the person who stands over you as you do the self-checkout that never works ever. 19 times ever. You only had 14 items, and somehow 19 times that thing tells you unexpected item in bag. Yeah, it's unexpected because I scanned it. You know, don't yell at those people. You know that, right? My goodness, that's frustrating. I can't be the only one, guys. That's good. That's good looking out. Okay. Don't double bag. We've heard advice for dealing with this. Anyway, like, you see, to be a Christian is to say, okay, I don't know what the future holds. Jesus doesn't know the second coming. Like, he didn't, whatever. Jesus says no one knows the day or the hour, right? So I don't know that. Paul calls the gospel a mystery. I can know what I can know, but I don't know everything about that. But sometimes the Bible gives us such clarity as to how we treat each other, about how we live, about not giving up. And we see in this story with Peter, Peter doesn't know what's going on at all. And God is saving him. Meaning Peter's just trying to be faithful, and God is doing what God does. And our faith is that. We just try to be faithful. We just try to be good. We just try to treat people the way we just try to follow Jesus, and God's going to do the God stuff that God does. And that's got to be enough for us. And when we do that, you find out that maybe some of the stuff we don't know doesn't super matter anyway. See, because there's great, look, I don't know what happens in the future. I don't know. But there is great peace in just knowing that whatever will happen, Christ will take care of that. It's like being in the car when you're a kid. Like, you don't know how to drive. You're in the car as a kid at night, right? Like, we all did this. We all do this. Like, kids always go to sleep in the car. Why? Because they trust you. They trust that you're not going to run them off the road. They don't know how to drive. They don't know how roads work. They don't know any. All they know is mom is driving, so I'll go to sleep. And in the same way, you and I can rest easy as whatever happens and all this stuff. I can just go to sleep. I can just relax because God is driving. He's got this under control. And as for me, I can just be the best person I can be, following Christ with faith and trust and hope. We're in our 6th week of our series called Extinct. Talk about the mammoth. We don't know how it went extinct. As we talk about our faith, we don't know exactly what's going on. We learn this final lesson from our series called Extinct. It goes like this. Our faith is not about the things we know. Instead, we trust Christ, whatever mysteries exist. Our faith is not about the things we know. Instead, we trust Christ, whatever mysteries exist. We're going to sing a song. Musicians are going to come forward. We offer an invitation. The Bible teaches we should repent to be baptized. It sounds like 2 things. I promise it's just one. As we repent, we are saying, I'd like to change. I'm committing to change. And in baptism, we are saying we are changing and aligning ourselves with Christ. Just as Christ was dead, buried, and raised, we metaphorically, allegorically, spiritually, really, in reality, are dead, buried, and raised with Christ. If you never made the decision, we got a nice warm baptistry. Let's talk. If you're already an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, it is not here. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, share the gospel, grow up while we do it. And we want to be people who understand that while we don't know everything, that we are called to have trust and faith and hope. As we stand,